Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 12 of my Knights of the Frozen Throne card review. This time around, I have 9 new cards, including the new Death Knight Priest Hero card, which is a pretty cool one. So here's how this is going to work. Like always, I'll be doing detailed reviews up front, and then I'll be doing quick reviews near the end of the video if you're only interested in the card reveals and my overall take. Then you can view the link in the description below. Click that and it'll take you to the end of the video where things move much quicker. But if you want to stick around and listen to me talk about these cards in more detail, well, now is the time to do exactly that. Up first is the new Priest Death Knight hero card, Shadowreaper Anduin. This is a new 8 mana card, of course 5 armor, like all the other hero cards. And the battle cry reads, destroy all minions with 5 or more attack. So it's Shadow Word Death, but for the entire board, and that's not just enemy minions, that is also your own minions, which is an interesting little downside. And the hero power here for Anduin is Void Form. It's a new 2 mana active hero power that deals 2 damage, and then after you play any card, Void Form is automatically refreshed. So essentially you can cast it multiple times in a single turn as long as you play multiple cards. And there's a lot of crazy stuff to talk about with that, which we'll get to in a second. But first, let's just talk about this card overall, right? How are these different components? So it's 8 mana, which is pretty darn expensive. But this battle cry does mean that you can swing the board in a favorable way. And I think you'll find that in many games, particularly games that go to turn 8, which are typically more late game style games, control matchups usually, there will be opportunities to play Shadowreaper Anduin, where he actually gets you on board value by killing some 5 attack stuff. And frankly, he might even be the kind of card you would occasionally save just because you know there's going to be a turn where he can kill multiple things. And you get real raw value out of Shadowreaper Anduin himself. And you're not just setting him up for a future opportunity like we've seen with a lot of the other Death Knight hero cards where they feel like they're going to be really big tempo losses and they're just big commitments and really slow. I don't think that's the case with Shadowreaper Anduin. I mean, there might be a card that would be ran that's just that good of a removal. Think about like a Jade board where you kill 3 or 4 Jades by playing Shadowreaper Anduin, plus you get the upside of the hero power and all that stuff. That's a really good swing. Now, there are some risks too. You know, you don't want to play this when you have your own board, so there's some drawbacks and decisions to be made there, but you can certainly build your deck in ways that can play around that or at least sacrifice something to gain the long-term advantage, because I do think Void Form is a really powerful hero power. We've seen before with Shadow Form that just getting that 2 damage consistently can go a really long way. Especially when you're, pinging away a board and killing stuff. 2 damage, it's twice as much as 1, but it really feels like even more than twice as much just because it tends to add up much faster and much more favorably. So that's cool. Plus, of course, it can just turn into a hero power for Hunter, Hunter hero power, where you just do 2 damage to your enemy's face all the time, which can be really powerful and oppressive in the right kind of matchup at the right moments. But also, ultimately, very flexible. Not to mention, of course, that in a deck designed to support Shadowreaper Anduin, you can get that hero power off a lot in a single turn. Especially if you play the card Raza the Chained that makes your hero power cost 0 mana, which is absolutely absurd, and I think that's the most obvious combo and way to support Shadowreaper Anduin. Make this thing 0 mana so that every card you play, you just get a free Void Form. You could cast 2, 3, 4 in a single turn. There are even some ridiculous combo potentials where you could cast 5 Void Forms in a single turn, 10 Void Forms maybe if there's some ridiculous, Radiant Elemental shenanigans. So the potential to do a lot of damage with Void Form is certainly there. It can be a control card. It can be a face damage kind of card. Shadowreaper Anduin's battle cry itself is really strong. This feels like the kind of thing that almost any priest could run. I don't think you have to design a deck specifically to support it, although it probably gets even better in that case, unlike a lot of the other Death Knight hero cards, which seem like they require specific kinds of environments to really work. So Shadowreaper Anduin seems like the most flexible, the most interesting, and maybe the most powerful Death Knight hero card yet to me. I think this is absolutely a playable card, and it fits the class really well. So I think we're going to see priests running Shadowreaper Anduin fairly consistently and doing a lot of work with the card as well. So now let's move on to a priest card that is far less exciting, but probably still okay. This is the Acolyte of Agony, a new 3-mana 3/3, and it very simply just has lifesteal. So this is basically the slower Earthen Ring Farseer, because Earthen Ring Farseer, 3-mana 3/3, it heals you for 3. Assuming the Acolyte of Agony gets to attack once, then it's exactly Earthen Ring Farseer. Of course, a little less flexible because you can't heal other minions and things, and the risk is that it doesn't actually ever get to heal if it gets frostbolted. So there's some risks, but there's also some potential upsides where this could heal multiple times over multiple turns. So it could heal you for 6, it could heal you for 9. So, you know, it's just one of those cards where, are you in an environment or a meta where this works better than Earthen Ring Farseer? If so, maybe run Acolyte of Agony. Do you have some sort of lifesteal combos you're looking to pull off somehow? Run Acolyte of Agony. Otherwise, maybe Earthen Ring Farseer just meets the need better. So a very boring card, a very simple card, but not a bad one in and of itself. I think it's okay. It just needs the right place to live. I don't know that it's going to make the cut in a lot of Priest decks just because it doesn't do anything that active or exciting. But a fine arena card, a fine inclusion for Priest, not the strongest 3-drop they have. I think Cabal Talon Priest probably still works out more favorably most of the time. But an okay card, just not a lot to say about it. And now I have a Mage card, a new secret called Frost Clone. Of course, 3 mana, as all secrets are. And after your opponent plays a minion, instead of copying that minion like you might do with Mirror Entity, this secret actually puts 2 copies of that minion into your hand. So this is much less of a tempo or board-oriented play like you might see with Mirror Entity, and much more of a value kind of play because you're generating resources. You're not necessarily saving mana. So this is basically a 3-mana draw 2 cards. So it looks a lot like, for instance, Arcane Intellect. The problem with Frost Clone is that you don't really know what cards you're going to get. They could be very, very weak cards, so it's not an Arcane Intellect, because Arcane Intellect, of course, draws you cards that you know you want to see because you ran them in your deck. This could get you really weak 1-drops, for instance, that you never want to see. It could just get you 2 1/1s that are useless, right? So, a lot of risk with Frost Clone, as there is sometimes with other secrets too, like Mirror Entity. The other downside for Frost Clone to me is that it actually operates on the same axis as Mirror Entity, and what I mean by that is that your opponent can counter Frost Clone in the same way that they counter Mirror Entity. So when they're going through and testing for secrets, they basically kind of get to test for both Mirror Entity and Frost Clone simultaneously. The one upside of Frost Clone is that things like Battle Cry minions do get much, much better with Frost Clone than they do with Mirror Entity. So Swashbucklers or Babbling Books, for instance, which are useless for Mirror Entity, are better for Frost Clone because you can get those in hand and activate those Battle Cries. So there is a little bit of a punish depending on how your opponent tests the Mirror Entity sometimes. Other times, it's just still going to be a really weak, 2/2 or 1/2 or 3/2 or some minion that you really don't have a need for. And you drew 2 of them, and you have to spend the mana to play them, and they're just not that advantageous. So Frost Clone ends up hurting you just as much as it helps you because you have to commit another 4 mana to some really weak play, so on and so forth. And you've therefore spent 7 mana on a couple 3/2s, and it's just not great, and it puts you behind. So I think this is not the kind of card that you necessarily want to run in your deck. It's okay sometimes probably off of secret generation or spell generation type stuff where you just get it for free and you throw it down and sometimes it rolls high and that's fine. But I don't think this is good enough to make the cut in secret mage style list. It doesn't have enough tempo or enough board presence, and those decks are really all about getting out on the board and tempo and applying pressure and getting out fast, and this one's much of a slower card. So I feel like this one's not going to go well for Mage. There are better options, better alternatives, more consistent cards out there. So Frost Clone feels fairly weak to me. Speaking of weak cards, we now have a new Warlock card, which is exactly what Warlock needed. This is the Wailing Felhound, a new minion for Warlock. It's a 3-mana 3/6. It's a demon, so that all looks fine. Yeah, 3/6, that's pretty good. But this effect is really, 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 really risky. Way riskier than the previous card, in fact. Whenever this minion takes damage, you discard a random card. So potentially with this thing, assuming no buff shenanigans, this could discard up to 6 cards by itself. So some people out there are going, ooh, it can complete the quest. all by itself. Nice. That's really good for Drakkari Sacrifice. Okay. Yeah, sure, but then your hand is totally empty, right? That's another downside, or almost always going to be totally empty if you were to play this on turn 3. Not to mention the fact that you're giving your opponent all the power to dictate when you discard, so a lot of the times they might just make you discard your quest because they have a lot of influence over Wailing Felhound's discard effect here. But ultimately and realistically, that's not going to be the scenario, right? Usually it's just going to discard 2 or 3 cards for its 6 health here. Sometimes maybe just even 1. But, basically compared to a vanilla 3-drop, which would be a 3/4, Spider Tank and various other 3-mana minions, you're getting 2 extra health. So you're kind of, trading a huge downside here, which is losing your entire hand beyond your control. One of the good things about discard, one of the few good things about discard, is that you often do get to decide when you discard, so you can play things in a way that makes it more likely you discard favorable targets. When you throw down the Wailing Felhound, you're giving that power to your opponent, and you don't have that control, and it's just all up in the air, and you don't know how many cards you're going to discard, which makes the unpredictability of discard even worse. And I think multiplying a very negative thing and making it even more negative is just far too much of a price to pay for only an advantage of 2 health. So Wailing Felhound to me seems incredibly risky. Some people are going to cite this play where you can treachery your Wailing Felhound and give it to your opponent, and then you can cast Spreading Madness and discard their entire hand. And I would argue that that's a 3-card, 9-mana play that would be very difficult to actually pull off in a real game successfully, just because, it wouldn't be the only minion on board necessarily. And you're having to include 2 terrible cards in your deck to do that are both useless in any other scenario. So as fun as that shenanigan might be, it's not, to me, a viable play at all. Leaving this card without any real place to see play. I think it looks bad on its own, it looks bad in combos, it's just way too risky. Even for discard decks to run, I just don't see how Wailing Felhound can be very good. This, to me, so far looks like one of the worst cards in the set. Despite a 3/6 that would normally be pretty exciting, this effect is just too detrimental. So up next is a new Hunter spell called Play Dead. We got a really cute zombie dog here in the artwork. And this one very simply triggers a friendly minion's Death Rattle effect. So 1 mana, summon a Death Rattle thing, or trigger a Death Rattle. We've seen this before a little bit with Feign Death, a 2-mana spell from a previous expansion that was able to trigger every minion's Death Rattle for only 2 mana. This one triggers a single Death Rattle for 1 mana, so definitely a little bit more flexible and targeted in its effect, but certainly less powerful on a raw scale compared to Feign Death, which, theoretically if you had 3 or 4 Death Rattles out there, you could get absurd value. Play Dead has a much lower cap on how much value it can actually achieve. The flexibility, I guess, is nice because sometimes, it is possible to float a single mana and accomplish something here. But the real question for Play Dead, and the biggest problem for this card, is how many Death Rattles are worth that much more than 1 mana, that it's worth including a 1 mana card in your deck, because Hunter already has such a problem with resources and card draw. The more cheap little spells like this that you run in your deck, the quicker you run out of cards, the quicker you run out of gas, and you just lose the game, particularly in a deck like a Death Rattle deck, which I would presume is usually a little bit more mid-rangey or even control-oriented, particularly in the context of the new expansion, where Hunter gets a lot of control tools. It seems like this would just be a really, really quick card to run in that environment, because it's just not giving you enough, and yet still taking up that slot in your deck and making it so you run out of cards faster. But, what's the best case scenario here? Maybe a Devilsaur Egg, where you get a 1 mana 5/5, which would be a really, really strong play, but you also had to play Devilsaur Egg and build your deck around Devilsaur Egg. So that's still actually a 4 mana commitment for a 5/5, which doesn't feel very good, particularly when you had to run 2 cards to do it. So unless your deck is very specifically designed for that, that's a weird use case. So if you look at more traditional Hunter Death Rattles, Savannah Highmane gives you 2 2/2s for 1 mana. So you could be a ballerina. But, that's kind of 4/4 in stats for 1 mana. That's a solid play, but if you've already gotten to the point where you've landed a Highmane Is this the kind of card you want in your deck? And I think, again, no. I think it's just too quick for that kind of deck. So if you look at cheaper Death Rattle minions, the Kindly Grandmothers and stuff, a 1-mana 3/2, sure, that's solid. It's fine. It's a Flame Imp, but basically it's a balanced card. It's not overpowered. So wouldn't you still be better off running something else, something more active, something that does a little bit more for its cost? So to me, Play Dead just doesn't seem like it's going to have enough weight, enough substance in any given Hunter deck that would make sense for it. So I think this card's going to fall short, despite the flexibility, which is nice, and having cheap spells sometimes can do cool stuff too. All that said, still just not strong enough. So up next is the Drakkari Defender, a new Shaman card. It's a 3-mana 2/8 taunt, so the Deathlord stats and mana cost here. But it does have a pretty strong price to pay, which is an overload of 3. So really, at the end of the day, you're going to most of the time spend 6 mana to play this 2/8 taunt, which is a little understated compared to vanilla 6 mana taunts that we've seen in the past. So you are still paying some price for the tempo advantage, right? Being able to cheat this out earlier does have a true cost, even compared to neutral vanilla style minions. So that's not great, but a 2/8 taunt on turn 3 is sometimes very powerful. The biggest problem for this card, I think, is the 2 attack. I think 3 attack is so much more significant and lines up so much more nicely against a lot of aggressive boards. I mean, if you just go through the list right now and you look at things like Pirate Warrior or Token Shaman, they have a lot of 3 health things out there. There's the Primal Fin totems, there's the Flame Tongue totems, there's the Bloodsail Raiders, a lot of 3 health kind of cards. So 2 health, I mean, yeah, it kills basic totems for Shaman and it kills Fireflies and stuff, but it's still going to whiff on a lot of things, allowing your opponent to make really favorable trades. Maybe it sets up for some Maelstrom Portals, but guess what? On turn 4, you can't afford the Maelstrom Portal because you're overloaded by 3, leaving you with only a single mana on turn 4, which is really, really hard to work with for Shaman. So if this were a 3 attack minion, I think it would be a lot better. If it was only Overload 2, obviously it would be a lot better and probably a playable card because it'd give you more flexibility when you played it on curve going into turn 4. But as it stands right now, there's just a couple numbers that feel like they don't line up very well in the context of actual matchups and actual metas. Now, if the meta were to shift and somehow 2 health things became more prominent, I think this is an okay card. It could see play. The fact that it costs a true 6 mana isn't that problematic if it's such a dominant turn 3 play that you're able to sacrifice the second turn and just shut out your opponent. That's totally fine if the meta supports that kind of thing, but it right now doesn't seem to. So I'm not totally against this card on a fundamental level. I think it could be good, and maybe it gets run in a control deck too that's got some overload clearance in Wild in particular with like Lava Shock, for instance. It would make a lot more sense. So it's a playable card. It's fine. It's just not particularly great, and I don't think it's going to be something we see commonly just from the decks here and there that might need it. I don't think this is some sort of aggro answer to the meta by any means. So Drakkari Defender, just fine, nothing too amazing. So to finish up the review, I have a handful of neutral cards. First of which is the Fallen Sun Cleric, which is a bit like the Shattered Sun Cleric, but instead it's a 2-mana 2/1, just dropping 1/1 off the cost of the card for a single mana. But it has the exact same battle cry, give a friendly minion +1/+1. And Shattered Sun Cleric, of course, not a card we see very often in Constructed, although in the past it was played in Zoo decks in Constructed and was a powerful card. So, it's viable. And I actually think Fallen Sun Cleric falls into a similar space and maybe is even a little bit better just because of its flexibility. The 1 health here is a problem, but with active Battlecry minions like this, I think there's a really important sort of calculation for the mana cost and the efficiency of these kinds of cards. In other words, the part you really care about is the battle cry. The minion that you leave behind is nice, it's important, but it's the active instant charging battle cry stats that are most important. So if you don't have to necessarily pay extra mana to still get that battle cry, I think you get to essentially do more for less cost because again, the thing you care about is now essentially 1 mana cheaper. So if you're just really into the buff and you want to buff something that's already on board, the Fallen Sun Cleric is a more flexible, more efficient way to do so. The body it leaves behind considerably worse, and I think this card would actually be way better if it was like a 1-2, just so it traded a little more favorably or set up for future buffs even better. So that would make this card stronger. Because as it stands, it still probably isn't strong enough to make the cut in Constructed, much like its cousin, the Shattered Sun Cleric. There are just better options and better plays. Now, in Arena, this is going to be a really fantastic card just because, you know, giving extra stats to things that are already on board is really strong, and the 1 health isn't nearly as detrimental nearly as often in Arena, probably, because sometimes those things just linger around and hang out and still contribute. But in Constructed, I mean, even in a Zoo deck or a really early board-based deck, there are stronger snowball-y turn 2 types of cards for most of the classes that want to utilize those kinds of cards. You know, Direwolf Alpha has always been kind of the classic go-to 2 mana plus stats on the board kind of thing. So even though that one's not permanent, I think it does more than Fallen Sun Cleric still. So this one's got a hard road to actually find a list that would want to run it, but not an inherently bad card. I think it's fine, and maybe even a little bit better than Shattered Sun Cleric 2. So up next is the Rattling Rascal, a new 4-mana 2/2 minion with a battle cry that summons a 5/5 skeleton. So you get a total of 7/7 in stats for 4 mana. Wow. But it also has a Death Rattle, summon a 5/5 skeleton for your opponent. So, I mean, very simply, if you look at this card at a glance, you say, oh, okay, so it gives a 5/5 to both people. Those kind of cancel each other out. So that leaves you with a 4-mana 2/2, which is a pretty terrible card. You could look at it that way, but I think that would be incorrect. I think there are actually a lot of advantages in this card summoning you a 5/5 on the Battlecry side of things. Just because you get the 5/5 first, right? Your opponent actually does have to kill the Rattling Rascal before they get the 2/2. So basically, their 5/5 is on a multiple turn delay, right? They have to commit to killing the 2/2 to get the 5/5, and then they don't get to attack with the 5/5 for multiple turns because they have to wait another turn to actually attack with it, right? So by that time, you've already had a full turn to get value out of your 5/5. They've potentially had to make some sort of inefficient play or removal on your Rattling Rascal just to ensure they get the 5/5. So they've sacrificed maybe some tempo, maybe they floated some mana, maybe they made a trade they wouldn't otherwise like to make. Maybe they had to spend mana on your 2/2, so they left your 5/5 sitting so you get the advantage of the stats. So this is, even though it looks like a 4-mana 2/2, still a fairly advantageous play when it comes to tempo. The question is it a good enough play? Aren't there just better, stronger 4-drops that do things faster? I think the answer there is probably yes. And of course, you don't want to run Rattling Rascal in any sort of Death Rattle style deck because you don't want this, you know, coming back again, or you don't want to utilize the synergies of this Death Rattle. Some people will go right back to Treachery because it seems like the meme card for Warlock. And sure, you could give this to your opponent after summoning the 5/5 and get another 5/5 in a Treachery style deck. But again, that's a 7-mana commitment, and you still have to kill the Rattling Rascal once it's over there, so there's a lot of commitments to that play that don't seem to make it very good. So I don't think Rattling Rascal is absolutely terrible, because, you know, if you did use this as a 4-drop in an aggro deck to finish your opponent off, and essentially they didn't have time to deal with the Rattling Rascal, you just get that 7/7 in stats total, which across multiple bodies can be good too. For instance, in an Evolve style deck, this could work really well, because then you lose the Death Rattle and you also gain a 5-drop off the Evolve. And presuming the 5/5 you summon here is a 4-drop, you get a second 5-drop. So this could work really nicely in an Evolve deck where you erase that Death Rattle. Maybe there's some sort of Silence synergy, but I doubt it, because Silence Priest already has a lot of great tools that this wouldn't necessarily match up very nicely in. So, at first glance, it looks like a pretty weak minion, but as you start to think about some potential ways to utilize it, you could see this being okay. I still don't think it's strong. I still think there are better options out there at the 4 slot for most everybody, but it's an okay card that could occasionally pop in. So don't totally count the Rattling Rascal out, despite his goofy artwork and his silly name. This could be a card we see some more of. And now, finally, I have one last neutral minion. This is the Deathspeaker, a new 3-mana 2/4 with a battle cry. Give a friendly minion immune this turn. So actually a really cool little minion here. It's going to be fantastic in Arena, by the way, because a 2/4 in Arena for 3 is okay. And this battle cry is absurd in Arena because it's basically the mega divine shield that allows you to make trades with full immunity, obviously, because it gives your minions immunity. So a great arena card right off the bat, that's clear. As far as constructed utility, I mean, this is the kind of thing that, again, it just could pop in from time to time, right? If a zoo deck needs to make trades early, sure, Deathspeaker can enable that. There might be some interesting synergies with this. For instance, one thing I saw mentioned is Giant Sandworm for Hunter. Basically, if you stick a Giant Sandworm, you could clear an entire board without taking any damage because of Giant Sandworm's effect, where it can attack multiple times if it kills a minion. So, like, sure, that's really cool. That's an 11 mana, 2-card play that's in a late game Hunter deck. So I'm not sure that exact thing is going to be a huge success or a real part of the meta at any given point. But you can envision other scenarios and other kinds of ways to utilize this card in sneaky ways. So I wouldn't be totally surprised if Deathspeaker shows up occasionally, but I don't think this is going to be a really common inclusion. I think it's just one of those fine vanilla cards that has a neat, unique effect, which is all really cool. Has solid stats for its cost. All the pieces are there. It's a totally just okay card, just not, again, going to be good enough necessarily to make a place for itself in a meta deck. So there you go, guys. Those are my detailed reviews. A lot of those cards just felt fine, but probably not good enough, which is okay. Those cards are important to exist. Occasionally they can make big impacts and be surprising and be influential. So that's good that they're not just terrible cards, that they have some potential is really, really nice. So what I'd like to do now is go through each of these cards and rate them from 1 to 5 stars in my quick reviews. I think Shadowreaper Anduin is a 5-star card. I think Acolyte of Agony is a 3-star card. I think Frost Clone is a 1-star card. I think Wailing Felhound is a 1-star card. I think Play Dead is a 1-star card. I think Drakkari Defender is a 2-star card. I think Fallen Sun Cleric is a 2-star card. I think Rattling Rascal is a 2-star card. And I think Deathspeaker is a 3-star card. And there you go, that wraps it up for part 12 of my Knights of the Frozen Throne card review. I'm really curious what you guys have to say about these cards. Did I miss anything important? Is there some cool interaction that I didn't see? Did I get some card crazy wrong and it's going to be amazing even though I thought it was terrible? Let me know in the comments below. Of course, as always, I love to hear your guys' spin on these cards, because sometimes I get them wrong and sometimes you guys enlighten me about things I never really thought of, so I always look forward to your comments. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.